And it's interesting, of course, because in any other city, I would say that sailing across the harbor to visit a remote island where only 850 people live would feel like an escape. But there's really no reason to escape. It's already a quiet and calm and picturesque, relaxing city.
Helsinki and Stockholm are two of Europe's most serene, polished, and rather mystical major cities. As the capitals of Finland and Sweden, respectively, both cities are densely packed with distinctive cultures, architecture, and cityscapes. Now, here on A Sense of Travel, my goal is to capture all 5 senses of as many cities, countries, and natural landmarks all around the world as I possibly can, so that I can accurately immerse you into the physical experience of those places through the screen. That said, today, I'm diving into more than just the things you can experience through photography or bullet lists. How do Helsinki and Stockholm stack up in the way they smell, the way the air feels, the ambience and the lore that creates the magic of the atmosphere, the sounds that fill your ears in the city streets, and, of course, the tastes that define each experience? We'll find out today in the latest installment of Comparing the Senses, Helsinki versus Stockholm. After the video, be sure to comment on which of these 2 cities you feel has an experience that fits your persona more. I'm Michael, and this is A Sense of Travel. Let's dive in. So, before we take on the senses, let's take a quick look at some very quick facts about each city, in case you aren't familiar with either one. Helsinki is the capital of Finland and sits right on the edge of the Gulf of Finland in the Baltic Sea. Nearly 700,000 people live in Helsinki's city limits, and nearly 1.6 million people live in the metro area. Stockholm is the capital of Sweden, sitting a bit inland from the Baltic on an archipelago and is a bit larger, home to nearly 1 million people in its city limits and nearly 2.5 million in its metro area. Both cities and their respective countries make up a part of the Nordic region, which includes the countries of Iceland, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland. So the first thing to look at when stacking up Helsinki and Stockholm is perhaps the most obvious thing: their cityscapes. We'll kick off in Helsinki. Helsinki's archipelago is located on the southern tip of Finland, right on the edge of the Baltic Sea, and is heavily influenced by the water. The horizon of the city is dominated on one side by the sea and its rocky islands, and on the other by the cool-toned patchwork of the city and the relatively flat, pine tree-layered finished landscape. Many of the apartment buildings in the urban area have glassed-in porches, which I found interesting. I guess it makes sense to be able to enjoy using your porch for more than just a couple months out of the year. Baroque bronze domes poke out from above the skyline of black and silver tin metal roofs, all of which are low-rise, with the exception of some skyscrapers off in the distance.
Something I've always admired about the Nordic countries and their capital cities is their ability to take modern, boxy-looking buildings and actually make them look good.
At the ground level, particularly in the downtown area, shades of white, brick brown, a golden beige, and a whole gradient of blue adorn the elegant building facades which sit on a grid of cobbled and paved streets. Much like Helsinki, Stockholm is heavily influenced by the water. It's spread across a series of 14 islands, and its brackish Nordic water plays a large role in the city's overall atmosphere. Like Helsinki, there are very few high-rise buildings in Stockholm, but the silhouette of the city is still quite distinctive. There are dozens of tall, pointed church steeples and spires instead, piercing the sky in random places. There's no direction you can turn without a towering spire in sight. Much of the city is built into rocky cliffside, providing gorgeous overlooks of the endless sea of spires and its waterways. The city feels relatively uniform outside of the modern box buildings and medieval churches. Buildings aren't nearly as flamboyant as they are in Paris, Madrid, Brussels, or Vienna. There are a lot of metal and shingled roofs rather than terracotta, There aren't stepped roof lines here signifying power and holiness like in the Dutch region, and there are a ton of trees integrated into the cityscape. Stockholm is quite a colorful and artistic city, and it's reflected well within its cityscape. Stockholm's underground metro stations double as public art galleries with murals painted along the exposed stone, blasted and carved directly into the hillsides. Helsinki's Old Town, set on a grid, is lined with low-rise buildings and cream-colored plaster facades, similar to other Nordic capitals. I suppose the bright, cheery colors help get people through those long winters. As you imagine yourself along those cobbled boulevards, picture a canyon of romantic, elegant, and detailed architecture in shades of brown, beige, and creamy yellow. The ornate buildings that line the street are roughly 5 stories tall, give or take, except for those grand, elegant, domed cathedrals that tower above the city center. The old market and its square retain that charm of old Helsinki here in Centrum, while places like the Oodi Library root Helsinki firmly in the 21st century. Large, open, cobbled squares and spacious parks like Kaivopuisto, along with indoor gallerias and malls at every turn, break up the grid. You'll notice that modern brick architecture, elegant Baroque facades, a touch of Art Nouveau, and vertical wooden sauna architecture dominates the cityscape. On snowy days, everything looks like a Christmas card. Stockholm's Old Town, known as Gamla Stan, is a bit more distinctive than Helsinki's, and many areas within it look as if they could exist in a Disney World park. Because of how immaculately polished it feels with its shimmering cobbled stones, smoothly painted facades, and picture-perfect angles at every turn, Stockholm's Old Town is almost the quintessential medieval European street. The narrow cobbled streets between the towering, creamy yellow buildings are wide enough for pedestrians, but not quite wide enough for dining terraces, and certainly not enough for cars. Swedish flags of blue and yellow fill the storefronts and hang above door frames, and every other shop is filled with Swedish souvenirs of Viking hats, troll figurines, rotating candle holders, and the do-it-yourself ingredients for afternoon fika. In Gamla Stan and throughout the greater city, the color palette along the unbreaking rows of 5 to 6 story buildings reminded me a bit of Madrid, Spain, with painted facades of creamy yellow, rustic reds and browns, and slightly off-whites. The facades are very clean. It seems as if most buildings were once brick, but now they're covered in a smooth type of stucco. The city's overall color palettes differ quite a bit in regard to the overall cityscapes, as indicated here. When you see a video or a picture of a place and you try to imagine what it must feel like to actually be there, an important component of that is the way the air smells. Let's see how Helsinki and Stockholm stack up. Helsinki feels truly remote, peacefully tucked away in the great white north. Fresh scents of salt water and earth fill your nostrils throughout the city, and in the wintertime, that fresh scent includes that of ice and snow. You'll notice that pine trees really dominate the scentscape, especially in the city's parks. Now, speaking of pine, there's a woodsy smell that you won't forget after a trip to Helsinki. Cedar wood. That's because the sauna is extremely important here, and hot cedar wood wafts through not only that of the saunas themselves, but also the chilly Nordic air throughout town. If I were to make a Helsinki-scented candle, it would smell of saltwater, fallen snow, pine, and cedarwood. Much like Helsinki, Stockholm is a remarkably fresh-smelling city. It's strange because something that differed in Stockholm from cities and rural towns that I've visited in the past is that it didn't really have one distinctive smell carrying through the air. For example, in London you can get wafts of what seems to be lavender, dew, diesel fuel, and coffee. And in Tokyo, you can actually smell soy and teriyaki in the air. In Dubai, you get steady scents of saltwater and oud. The best way I can describe the air in Stockholm is fresh, floral, and green. Of course, wafts of fishy water, damp stone, wild greenery, and aster flowers would make up the keynotes in a Stockholm scented candle, were I to create one. It's tough to compare the tastes of Helsinki and Stockholm because, frankly, they're both underrated, delicious, and in some ways quite related. A shared oceanic history, the Swedish invasion of Finland, and other similar cultural backgrounds from Nordic influences have created cuisines that are far more similar than they are different. However, each city and country has a few dishes that really set one apart from the other. So let's take a look at these tastes that really capture each city. Look, whether it's the people, the cafes, or, of course, the food, everything but the weather in Helsinki feels like a warm, cozy hug. Here are some of the dishes that really capture that feeling. Lahikieto. A traditional soup here in Finland is called lahikieto, or salmon soup. Now this soup is warm, creamy, and salmony, and perfect for a cold day. Filled with potatoes, a creamy broth, and salmon, it comes self-served with soft rye bread, another Nordic staple, and a baguette. Blueberry pie. A classic Finnish dessert, and just like a buttery blueberry muffin, this square slice of pie was warm and moist and just the right amount of blueberry-ish. I tried mine at Cafe Silo on Suomenlinna Island. Lonkero. Lonkero, or long drinks, are a Finnish staple. They also come with ice, which is crazy to me, but it's delicious. There's a definite tartness to it. Cloudy and clear, this drink blends perfectly with the snowy sky. While Sweden has some distinctive dishes, the most interesting element of Swedish cuisine lies in tradition. Fika. Each afternoon, Swedes take a traditional break for relaxation, conversation, and rejuvenation. Usually involving coffee and a decadent dessert, for example, rich chocolate cake, afternoon fika is a tradition that should really be replicated worldwide. Swedish meatballs. Perhaps Sweden's most classic dish is a warm plate of sauced Swedish meatballs, roasted potatoes, and a spread of lingonberries. The closest comparison of which I can find are cranberries, which are pretty common here in the US. Skagen. A typical dish that can be eaten both as a snack or as a meal itself is known as skagen, which is typically spread on toast. The skagen mix, which consists of mayonnaise, butter, chives, and shrimp, is spread over slices of rye bread. Reindeer. Something that can be a little jarring if you aren't from this part of the world is the sight of reindeer on the menu. You know, I was a bit hesitant myself, but the reindeer was tender, juicy, and incredibly flavorful. To pair with it, try a few goblets of crisp, light honey mead. Might make you feel better about eating Rudolph. There's no clear winner in the realm of cuisines necessarily, although I did personally find Finland to have some of the best food in the Nordic countries, and this is also not even close to a comprehensive list of the defining tastes of each city. Helsinki has a soundtrack that's quite distinctive. Heavy tram wheels rolling along the tracks in the cobbled Centrum streets can be heard from virtually everywhere, even from inside. This may sound jarring in theory, but I found it kind of relaxing. On the hour, you'll notice church bells chiming, joining a soundscape filled with cars bouncing over cobbled stones, birds chirping, and crows cawing. I mentioned cars on cobbled stones, but truthfully, it isn't nearly as common of a sound as you'd find in a lot of other places, thanks to those aforementioned trams. Helsinki's sounds are quite nautical, thanks to its location on the Baltic Sea. That said, the soundtrack of Helsinki includes seagulls crying and distant boat horns from the icy harbor. Like Helsinki, there's very little automotive sound in Stockholm, and this is strategic. In its green and sustainable efforts, Stockholm has actually been named Europe's leading green capital. The city has significantly reduced individual automobile ownership with car shares, invested in high-quality public transportation, created bike paths, allowed development without parking requirements, and encouraged high walkability. What you hear instead is the soft rushing of the waterways, pedestrians walking, chatting, and laughing, and occasional street music. The sound of sirens echoing through the urban canyons is quite rare here, a stark difference from most large cities. In shops, restaurants, cars, and speakers, it's clear that EDM, or electronic dance music, is still the music of choice here. This doesn't surprise me at all, given that dance music legends such as Swedish House Mafia, Avicii, and Iconopop all called Stockholm home. If you're familiar with where Helsinki is on a map, you know it can get cold. Helsinki experiences a humid continental climate, which means that it gets warm, sometimes even hot, summers, and bitterly cold, snowy winters. For example, I visited Helsinki in April and battled a snowstorm during my mile-long walk to Loilisana. Personally, I love snow, so this didn't bother me one bit, but it's important to keep in mind.
You know, I think it's safe to say that April in Helsinki is not springtime.
Just like Helsinki, Stockholm experiences a humid continental climate, and even in late May and early June, it can be a bit chilly and misty here. There were days during my visit that didn't make it out of the 50s in Fahrenheit. However, when the air warms up, it is absolutely splendid, as with the low humidity and the sea breeze, you never feel more than pleasantly warm. So what do I mean when I talk about the comparison of the ambience and the lore of each city? Well, for starters, I'm a strong proponent of the idea that to really capture the spirit and the magic of places around the world, you have to let your imagination roam a bit wild. After all, urban legends, mythological fairy tales, and dramatized history are a big part of the identity of cities and countries worldwide. Letting fantasy and folklore infiltrate your mind as you wander about can really bring out the mystique and the charm in different places. Let's start with Helsinki. Helsinki is a soft city, and I don't mean that in a negative way at all. It's soft in that it's not abrasive, and it feels incredibly livable and welcoming. There's a genuine sense of contentment in the air. After all, Finland is regularly ranked the happiest country in the world. I remember thinking that Oslo, Norway felt super remote the first time I visited, but Helsinki takes the crown on this one. You get the sense that you really are out there in the Great White North, and the folk stories and themes throughout town seem to rest heavily in that subarctic Nordic realm. That sense of a cozy refuge from a snowy Nordic winter can best be felt in Helsinki's saunas, which are a huge part of Finnish tradition. There's really nothing like watching a raging snowstorm cascade over the Baltic Sea from inside a steaming hot cider wood box with 10 of your new best friends. Also, Santa Claus is from Finland. I mean, need I say more? Sweden feels like a fairy tale forest. Stockholm feels like a magical, medieval fishing city within that forest. With museums like the Vasa Museum and the Viking Museum, Nordic statues, medieval spires, moss-layered urban forests and waterways, the tight cobbled streets of Gamla Stan, and tourist shops filled with Viking hats and trolls, Stockholm feels like a fairy tale fishing city within that forest world. It feels magical, as if the forests and parks are inhabited by elves, gnomes, fairies, and trolls. As if the skies could well be filled with dragons. The streets, as you move away from the modern centers, take you into a fantasy world where medieval fishing merchants dwell among wizards. The idea here isn't to pit these cities up against each other. In fact, the idea is to celebrate the fact that there's so much world to discover, experience, and explore. Thanks for diving into the Nordic capitals of Helsinki and Stockholm with me today, and stay tuned for more city comparisons in the near future. As always, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.